My name is Evan Thompson. I am the Executive Director of Preservation Texas, the only statewide nonprofit historic preservation organization in Texas. We own a historic farm and ranch called Bassett Farms Conservancy. Through research, I have rediscovered the Hopewell Freedom Colony that once existed at Bassett Farms. As a lawyer and historian by training, I have enjoyed researching the property, and in this short video, we'll share with you some of the resources that have allowed me to learn more about the men and women of the Hopewell Freedom Colony. Bassett Farms is located roughly at the center of a triangle formed by the major metropolitan areas of Houston, San Antonio, and Dallas-Fort Worth. Bassett Farms is about an hour from Waco, Temple, and College Station, but otherwise situated in a very rural area of Falls and Limestone counties that was once one of the most productive cotton growing regions in Texas. The nearest community is the small town of Cossie, laid out in 1870 on the Houston and Texas Central Railroad. The railroad encouraged development of the region and made it possible for cotton to be shipped to markets in Houston and Galveston. Through careful deed research, I've been able to document that a portion of Bassett Farms had been owned by formerly enslaved black men and women. These men and women formed a community called Hopewell, and the Hopewell Cemetery is one of the most important cultural resources at Bassett Farms Conservancy. These deeds were an important starting point for research because they give the names of the men who were the founders of the community: Reverend Henry Jefferson, William Moten, Dred Williams, Robert Greene, Edmund Taylor, and Anderson Jefferson. Like many freedom colonies, Hopewell was located along the county line, far from the county seat, on lands that were often wet and difficult to farm. The founder of the Hopewell Baptist Church and one of the original landowners was Elder Henry Jefferson. His headstone shows that he was born in 1836, died in 1889, and was ordained in 1869. The Hopewell Cemetery is located on what was once his farm. The Hopewell Baptist Church no longer stands. This is the only known photograph of the church. The small marker in front of the church still survives today to mark its former location. When we inherited Bassett Farms at Preservation, Texas, from the Bassett family, no one knew about Hopewell Freedom Colony. While the Hopewell Cemetery was marked by a highway sign, the story of the community had been lost. Yet by looking at photographs in the Bassett family photo albums, we find evidence that even into the 1930s, the black men and women were part of the daily life at Bassett Farms, and the relationship between the Bassett family and the men and women of Hopewell were intertwined. We don't know who this couple is, but they were working at Bassett Farms in the 1920s. They are standing in front of a small building that stood over the Bassett House cistern. The Bassetts relied on the men and women of Hopewell to support the farm. It was in many respects a continuation of plantation slavery. The story of Bassett Farms is incomplete without an understanding of Hopewell. Even into the 1980s, B.D. Jones, a descendant of Hopewell founder Dred Williams, was the Bassett Farms ranch manager. His house remains. It is in this house that we found the Hopewell Church Register. Family archives have been important. This small notebook belonged to Mrs. Bassett in the 1890s. She would record when Hopewell residents would graze their livestock in her pasture. They would repay her by doing chores at Bassett Farms. This page shows that in some year in the 1890s, on April 23rd, Rena Jones put her mule in the pasture at the rate of $1 per month. Rena was the widow of Dred Williams, a Hopewell founder and Union Navy veteran. This 1931 store ledger was found at the Cossie Heritage Society. It shows black men, such as Ephraim Spencer and Peter Jackson, with accounts at the store under the name of Mrs. Bassett. Eve and Peter both worked for her. Maps are an important way to learn about freedom colonies such as Hopewell. Almost all of the houses at Hopewell are gone and have been gone for a long time. One way that we have been able to learn about where they had been located is through the 1936 Soil Survey map of Falls County. We found it through the University of North Texas's Portal to Texas History website. The map was prepared to show soil types, but it also shows the location of buildings. Importantly, the data was compiled in 1932, 4 years before the date of the map's publication. Hopewell is located on the eastern edge of Falls County. Let's take a closer look. The map shows the location of Hopewell Church, some dotted lines for roads, and a lot of small black squares for houses as they stood in 1932. Almost all of these houses are gone today, but we now know where we might undertake archaeological work to find evidence of Hopewell's material culture. Another map resource is the early highway map of Falls County. We found this one on the website of the Texas Digital Archive. The map reveals the location of roads and structures in 1940. Importantly, by comparing the 1932 and 1940 map data, we can see changes. On the left, the earlier map, the building with a cross is the Hopewell Church, but it was located away from the main farm road at the center of the community. But by 1940, the map shows that the building, known as Hopewell Baptist Church, had either been moved or reconstructed along the road. This is because by that time, most people who attended Hopewell Church had moved away and would come by car. It made more sense for the church to be located near the road. We have only learned that this building was moved through these maps. In 1880, the United States Census included statistics about farming. Hopewell was a farming community. These are important records to use to learn more about the men who were farming in 1880. We found the Hopewell community recorded, and it gives information about whether each farm was owned or rented, how many acres it contained, what types of crops were being grown, how many animals they owned. Here's a closer look at some of the Hopewell names in Falls County in 1880. We see Robert Green, William Moten, Joe Jones, Anderson Jefferson, and others whose names start to become more familiar as I was doing research. I transcribed the census data into a spreadsheet to make it easier to study and compare the data. For instance, Elder Henry Jefferson's farm was revealed to be one of the most valuable. The Hopewell Cemetery is an important cultural resource. The headstones marking the graves of those buried in Hopewell provide information that is useful for research. Unfortunately, most of the earliest burials were not marked by headstones. But as headstones were discovered in the overgrown cemetery, I took photographs and added them to a website called Find a Grave. Find a Grave is a great way to document the burials in a cemetery and allows others to contribute information as well. Descendants can locate their ancestors in Hopewell Cemetery through this website. This is an example of a Find a Grave entry for Hopewell. This is the page for Lewis Cleveland Dunn, who died in 1970. A relative added his photograph. On Find a Grave, we have 115 burials recorded, but only 30% of those have headstones. How did we find so many more? Well, I was able to use Texas death records to find men and women buried at Hopewell who don't have headstones. You can search the death certificates on Ancestry.com. In the place of death, I searched for Falls County, Limestone County, and Cossie. I also limited the search to men and women who were black. I then read each death certificate to see where those men and women were buried. I found about 80 additional burials in Hopewell through this method. Keep in mind that this is only going to uncover men and women who died after 1903 with a death certificate. This is the death certificate for Martha Timms, who died in 1940. She doesn't have a headstone at Hopewell, but the certificate states that she was buried there on March 13, 1940. A photograph of Martha's son and his wife hangs in the Falls County Museum. Now we've been able to make a connection between this artifact and the Hopewell Freedom Colony through death certificates. I found the old Hopewell church register in the former home of B.D. Jones. The register is an important record. Church records are irreplaceable. This register includes meeting minutes and lists of those who attended church services. Many of these men and women didn't own property and don't have headstones in Hopewell, so it provides more evidence of men and women who were part of the community for whom we didn't have records before. I transcribed them into a spreadsheet, highlighting in green when they attended church, and highlighting in red those who I've been able to find were buried at Hopewell Cemetery based on other records. It's important to start to synthesize the information from different places to make connections and start to build out the community. Digging deeper, you can find information about early black residents of freedom colonies such as Hopewell in the 1867 Texas voter registration books. These can also be searched on Ancestry. Once I knew the names of the founders, I could search for them directly here. On this page in Falls County, I was able to find Henry Jefferson and William Moten on the voter registration list. But what's more important than knowing that they registered to vote in 1867 is the fact that they were recorded one after the other. You'll see by looking at this list that it is not an alphabetical list. It means that the names were recorded as the men came up to the desk to be recorded. William Moten was followed by Henry Jefferson. That means they were standing in line together. William Moten and Henry Jefferson founded the Hopewell Freedom Colony in 1873. This record shows that they knew each other some years before they founded the community. They must have been planning it for years. Another surprising source of information is the 1890 Veteran Census. Black men who served in the Civil War and their widows can be found recorded here. It's worth a look, even if you're not sure that you have a veteran in your community. Sure enough, in Falls County, I found Martha Green, widow of Hopewell founder Robert Green. This is important. The entry gives information about Robert Green's enlistment in the United States Navy at New Orleans in 1863. And it says he was captured by Confederates at Galveston and that there was no discharge record. Deeds and census records showed that Robert and Martha Green lived at Hopewell. His military service records opened up a new avenue of research as his widow Martha applied for a widow's pension. The widow's pension file includes extensive testimony by Martha, her neighbors, family, even the family that enslaved her. All had sworn testimony about Martha and Robert in the file. Testimony from others enslaved with Martha, such as Frank P. Mays, give details about her early marriage to another man named Jim, her marriage to Robert, and her life after slavery. We learn from this record that Robert died in 1888, that he was buried in the cemetery 150 yards from his house, Hopewell, and even who paid for his coffin. Military records, particularly pension records for the men and women who served in the Union, are irreplaceable records that provide detail that you will find in no other place. Now, local newspapers rarely included information about black residents of the community, but sometimes they did. A local woman transcribed most of the obituaries from the early Kasi newspapers. Reading through those entries, I found an entry like this one. Cossie Cyclone 1909, Old Time Negro Dead, Old Aunt Liza Love, died at her home on Mrs. Bassett's farm Tuesday night, being aged about 80. Her body was laid to rest at the Negro burial grounds west of town. Now, two things are important in an entry like this. One, it directly ties Aunt Liza Love to Mrs. Bassett's farm. That means she lived at Bassett Farm on probably a rental property that would have been part of the Hopewell community. And number two, that she was buried in those burial grounds west of town, which is precisely where Hopewell Cemetery is located. There's no death record that we have found for Liza. We don't know anything else about her except for this record that ties her to Hopewell Cemetery. So now we have a new name, a new record to connect to other records. So, newspapers are incredibly important. Now, the undertaker in Cossie was a man named White, and fortunately his funeral home records have been transcribed. Now, racist practices meant that most blacks were recorded without names in these records. But this particular record, showing someone who died in October 1914, although no name is given, it matches records that suggest that this is the burial record for Martha Green, who we know died at this time. Now, here are two entries from that same funeral record book for a man named Tony Lloyd. Now, Tony Lloyd didn't die twice in 1910 and 1912, so it's unclear. Now, did he just pay for two burials, or is he even one of them? Well, we're able to resolve this by taking Tony's name and going back into the death certificates that we had been looking at. Now, Tony Lloyd's record doesn't show where he's buried. It does show that he died on December 21st, 1922, but the cemetery entry is blank. So he would not have come up with my death certificate search for Hopewell Cemetery. But going back to the funeral record, here it shows Tony Lloyd buried December 22nd, 1912 in the colored cemetery. That puts him in Hopewell. How do we know this? Well, we can look further for information about Tony. The 1910 census shows that Tony and his family lived among the men and women we know were tied to Hopewell. Now, other entries have no names at all. Interestingly, here are two black people from 1916 and 1917 whose funerals were paid for by Mrs. Bassett. I don't know who they were. Now, in summary, here's a case study for Amanda or Mandy Adams. Here's her death record. It shows she's buried in Hopewell. She died in 1929. Now, family letters written by Mrs. Bassett to one of her granddaughters were located, and in 1919, a letter records that Aunt Mandy is here ironing. This is probably the same person as the Mandy Adams who died in 1929. Mandy Adams, who died in 1929, doing domestic work for Mrs. Bassett in 1919, raises the question, is she one of the women in those old family photos? Now, proof that Aunt Mandy and Mandy Adams were one and the same comes from census records. Here's the 1920 census showing Anderson and Mandy Adams living at Hopewell. If you look at their census entry at the middle of the page, they were renting property, but they were located in between property owners like Martha Timms and Rena Jones Moore, who lived at Hopewell. So this squarely places Anderson and Mandy Adams in the Hopewell community in 1920. Now, going back to the church records that we had transcribed, we find that Amanda or Mandy Adams is attending church services in 1922 and 1923. So again, another piece of evidence putting Mandy Adams back into the Hopewell community. Falls County marriage records record the marriage of Anderson Adams and Mandy Tiller in Falls County in December 1884. Why is this record of particular interest? Well, look at who performed the marriage. Elder Henry Jefferson, the founder of Hopewell and the minister at the Hopewell Baptist Church. This record ties Mandy and her husband Anderson back to Hopewell decades earlier than those census records, the family letter, and even the death record would indicate. And in 1930, we find in the census record Anderson Adams living without his wife Mandy as a widow near Martha Timms at Hopewell, because Martha had died the year before. Through deeds, census records, church records, newspapers, funeral home records, marriage records, military records, family letters, store ledgers, soil survey and highway maps, and even cemetery headstones, you can start to reconstruct forgotten places like Hopewell Freedom Colony and forgotten people like Mandy Adams. As we develop educational programs at Bassett Farms Conservancy, the Hopewell Freedom Colony will play a central role. Archival research is critical to understanding these places. I hope that this video will inspire you to undertake research of your own. For more information, visit www.bassettfarms.org.